I was walking home later than usual that night, sometime after 11, when the streets had already settled into that hollow quiet that only exists on weekdays, when the city is tired and no longer pretending to be alive, and I remember checking my phone for the time because the air felt colder than it should have been for early autumn, and I wanted confirmation that the night really was as late as it felt. The rain had just stopped, leaving the sidewalks dark and reflective, and every streetlight smeared itself across the ground like it was melting, and my shoes made soft, wet sounds that seemed louder than they should have been, echoing a little too long between the buildings, which made me slow my pace without really meaning to. I took the same route I always did, past the closed bakery, the bus stop with the flickering ad screen, and the small row of shops that never seemed to open during the day but always felt watched at night, and I remember thinking about how familiar everything felt, how routine can sometimes make you careless, which made the quiet feel heavier. That was when I walked past the store with the wide glass window, the one that used to sell electronics years ago but now sat empty with dusty shelves and a faded sign still taped inside, and I glanced at the window without thinking, just a reflex, expecting to see myself moving past like I always did. But the reflection didn't move. I took another step before my mind caught up, and in the glass, I was still standing there, frozen in the same posture I had been in a moment earlier, my head slightly tilted, my arms loose at my sides, as if time had simply decided to stop for only one version of me, and that delayed understanding made my stomach tighten. I stopped walking, my shoes pressing into the damp pavement, and only then did the reflection move, snapping into place so suddenly that it felt wrong, like a video skipping forward, and I told myself it was just the lighting, just the angle, just my tired eyes filling in gaps that weren't really there. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at my own face in the glass, noticing details I normally wouldn't, like how pale I looked under the streetlight, or how my expression didn't match how I felt inside, which was more tense than confused, more alert than calm, and that mismatch made me uneasy. When I finally started walking again, I made sure to watch the reflection the entire time, counting my steps, watching for any delay, and for a few seconds everything seemed normal, almost disappointingly so, which somehow made me more nervous than relief ever could. The rainwater on the window rippled slightly as a breeze passed, warping my shape just enough to give me an excuse to keep doubting myself, and I remember letting out a quiet breath, feeling foolish for letting something so small get to me, even though my shoulders stayed tight. I walked another block before realizing I was still thinking about that window, replaying the moment in my head, wondering how long the reflection had stayed still, wondering if it had been seconds or something shorter that only felt long because I noticed it, and that uncertainty followed me like a sound just out of range. The streets grew narrower as I moved away from the main road, and the lights became more spaced out, leaving long stretches of shadow between them, and every dark storefront I passed felt like it might show me something I didn't want to see if I looked too closely. I tried to focus on normal things, the hum of distant traffic, the smell of wet concrete, the ache in my feet, but my eyes kept drifting toward the windows anyway, catching fragments of myself moving alongside me, and every reflection felt slightly off, like it was always a fraction behind. At one point, I stopped completely, just to test it, standing under a streetlight and watching the glass of a closed cafe across the road, and my reflection stopped too, perfectly still, which should have reassured me, but instead made my chest feel tight. I waited there longer than made sense, counting slowly in my head, listening to my own breathing, and for a brief moment I thought the reflection blinked after I did, not with me, and that tiny delay was enough to make my skin prickle. I laughed quietly at myself, the sound thin and strange in the empty street, and told myself I was tired, that the mind looks for patterns when it's bored or stressed, but even as I started walking again, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had already slipped out of sync. When I reached the next intersection, I glanced back the way I'd come, and for a second I thought I saw myself still standing near the electronics store window, small and dark in the distance, before the streetlight flickered and the image disappeared. I stood there, heart beating harder than it should have, telling myself it was just perspective, just a trick of light and memory overlapping, but the idea that I might have left something of myself behind lingered in my thoughts. By the time I reached my apartment building, my reflection in the glass door looked normal again, moving when I moved, responding exactly as it should, but I still hesitated before going inside, watching closely, waiting for it to betray me. I locked the door behind me and stood in the quiet hallway, listening to the distant sound of pipes and someone walking above me, and I realized my reflection was gone now, replaced by nothing but blank walls and dim light, which somehow felt worse. Later, lying in bed, I kept thinking about that window, about how my reflection had stood still while I walked away, and I wondered, in a way I still do, whether it had been waiting for me to notice, or whether it was still standing there even now, watching the street long after I left. Sometimes, when I pass windows at night, I slow down without realizing it, afraid of what I might see if I move too fast, and afraid of what it might mean if one day, the reflection decides not to follow me at all. I noticed her while I was crossing the street, just past midnight, when the traffic lights were cycling for no one and the air smelled faintly of wet asphalt, and the bus stop came into view under a single flickering lamp that made everything beneath it look flatter and unreal. She was standing where the bus stop was supposed to be, right under the sign with the route numbers peeling off, and the first thing that struck me wasn't her face or her clothes, but the fact that there was no bench behind her, no shelter, nothing at all except bare concrete where I clearly remembered a bench being for years. I slowed my steps without meaning to, my shoes scuffing softly, and I told myself the bench must have been removed for repairs or vandalism, because benches disappear sometimes, and people don't, and that felt like the more reasonable explanation in that moment. She didn't move as I approached, not shifting her weight or checking a phone, just standing there with her arms at her sides, watching the road as if she were waiting for something that had already passed, and the stillness of her posture made the space around her feel tighter. I passed the bus stop often, sometimes during the day, sometimes late like this, and I was certain there had always been a bench there, scratched and cold and uncomfortable, but reliable, and the empty space behind her looked wrong, like a missing tooth you can't stop noticing. As I got closer, I realized she wasn't watching the road at all. She was watching me. Her head didn't turn when our eyes met, it was already angled slightly in my direction, as if she'd been aware of me long before I noticed her, and that quiet awareness made my stomach sink in a way I couldn't explain. I nodded without thinking, a small, polite reflex meant for normal situations, but she didn't respond, didn't blink, didn't shift, and the silence between us stretched longer than felt comfortable in a place meant for waiting. I walked past her, close enough to hear the faint sound of her breathing, shallow and even, and I felt the urge to glance back immediately, the way you do when someone's attention feels too heavy on your back. When I looked over my shoulder, she was still facing me, her body unmoved, her eyes following me without her head turning further, and behind her, the concrete remained bare, unmarked, like no bench had ever been there at all. I walked another few steps before stopping entirely, my heart thudding louder than the night, and I turned around fully this time, pretending I'd dropped something, just to justify looking. She hadn't moved. The bus stop sign rattled slightly in the breeze above her, but she stood completely still beneath it, like part of the structure rather than someone using it, and the longer I looked, the more certain I became that she wasn't waiting for a bus. I told myself to keep going. I turned away and continued down the sidewalk, but the sensation of being watched didn't fade, and every step felt measured, deliberate, as if I were moving through someone else's field of vision. At the next corner, curiosity got the better of me, and I glanced back again, expecting relief, expecting to see the stop empty or the woman gone, but she was still there, smaller now with distance, still standing where the bench should have been. I noticed then that her feet weren't aligned with the curb like most people waiting, but pointed directly toward the street, toes just shy of the edge, as if she might step forward without warning. The street remained empty, no headlights, no engine sounds, nothing that suggested a bus was coming, and yet she continued to wait, watching me as I slowly disappeared around the corner. When I reached my apartment, I felt unsettled in a way that clung to me even after I locked the door, and I found myself standing at the window, looking down at the street below, half expecting to see her standing there too. I didn't sleep well that night, waking often with the image of that empty bus stop in my mind, the missing bench more unsettling than her presence, like something had been erased but forgotten by everyone except me. The next evening, I passed the same spot earlier, while there was still some light left in the sky, and the bench was there again, old and chipped and exactly where it always had been, bolted into the concrete like it never left. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it, imagining the space empty, imagining her standing there without it, and I felt a quiet dread settle in my chest. I still take that route, but I avoid the bus stop after dark now, crossing the street long before I reach it, because sometimes, even from a distance, I think I can see someone standing beside the bench, not sitting, not waiting, just watching the space where I'm supposed to walk. The first thing I noticed was the color of the light, because it was wrong for the time of day, too pale and too sharp, cutting through the air in a way that belonged to night, not late afternoon, and it made me slow down without understanding why. It was around 5:30 in the evening, that quiet stretch before sunset when the sky turns dull and heavy but still holds its shape, and I was walking home along a residential street I'd taken hundreds of times, past parked cars still warm from the day and houses with curtains half drawn, everything normal enough to feel safe. Then I saw the streetlight ahead of me glowing. At first I thought my eyes were adjusting strangely, or maybe a cloud had passed in front of the sun, but when I looked up, the sky was still bright, washed in soft gold, and the light from the pole was unmistakably on, humming faintly, casting a thin shadow across the sidewalk. I stopped walking and checked my phone, half expecting it to be later than I thought, but the screen confirmed the time, the numbers steady and clear, and I felt a small knot form in my chest as I looked back at the light. Streetlights don't turn on early here. They're automatic, tied to sensors that wait until the sun has fully disappeared, and I'd lived on this street long enough to know the rhythm of it, the way the lights all come on together like a quiet agreement, never early, never alone. This one stood by itself, already awake. I stood there longer than I should have, watching the faint glow spill onto the pavement, and I remember feeling embarrassed for being unsettled, because it was just a light, just a malfunction, something ordinary with a simple explanation I didn't need to know. Still, I hesitated before walking beneath it. As I stepped closer, the air felt different, cooler somehow, and the hum of the light grew more noticeable, a low, steady sound that pressed gently against my ears, and I found myself glancing up at the bulb, half expecting it to flicker or go out. It didn't. The light remained steady as I passed under it, and for a moment, my shadow stretched sharply in front of me, dark and well-defined, too clear for the time of day, and that sharpness made my stomach tighten. I kept walking, telling myself I was overthinking it, that I'd forget about it by the time I got home, but every few steps, I felt the urge to look back, like the light might be watching me instead. When I finally did glance over my shoulder, it was still on, bright against the fading sky, and I noticed then that none of the other streetlights were lit, even the ones further down the road already sinking into shade. I picked up my pace. The rest of the walk passed quietly, but the image of that light stayed with me, and later, from my apartment window, I watched the street as the sun finally slipped below the rooftops and the rest of the lights flickered on, one by one. The early one blended in then, no longer out of place, just another dot of yellow in the growing dark, and that should have been the end of it. The next evening, I paid attention. I found myself checking the time again as I approached the same spot, watching the sky, waiting for the light to betray itself, but it stayed off until sunset, behaving exactly as it should, and I felt a quiet relief I hadn't realized I was waiting for. For a few days, everything stayed normal. Then one afternoon, earlier than before, closer to 4, I saw it on again. This time, the sky was even brighter, the sun still high enough to glare off windshields and windows, and the light looked absurd against it, like a mistake that refused to correct itself. I stopped across the street and stared. No one else seemed to notice. Cars passed, people walked by with grocery bags and headphones, stepping through the light without a glance, their shadows briefly sharpening before dissolving again, and I felt strangely alone in my awareness of it. I told myself to take a picture, to prove to myself later that it had happened, but when I lifted my phone, the screen dimmed slightly, adjusting for brightness, and the light didn't look as wrong through the camera, almost normal enough to dismiss. I lowered the phone without taking the photo. That night, I dreamed of the streetlight. In the dream, it turned on earlier and earlier each day, until it was glowing in the morning, then before dawn, lighting an empty street under a dark sky while the rest of the world slept, and I woke with the faint sound of humming in my ears. After that, I started noticing other things. The light seemed brighter than the others at night, its circle of illumination wider, more defined, and I began to feel a subtle pressure when I walked beneath it, like the space there was heavier, more occupied. One evening, as I passed under it again, I realized my shadow lagged behind me, just slightly, stretching and then pulling itself forward a moment later, and I stopped walking, my heart pounding softly. The shadow caught up. I stood there, under the light, listening to the hum, and for a moment, I had the unsettling sense that the light had turned on early because it was waiting for me, not the sunset. I moved away quickly, not looking back. Now, whenever I walk that street, I watch the light more than the sky, checking its glow instead of the time, because sometimes, even when the sun is still up, I can see the faintest hint of brightness in the bulb, like it's trying to wake itself early again. And I've started to wonder if one day it will turn on while the sun is still directly overhead, bright and unmistakable, and no one else will stop walking when it does. I heard it just as I was reaching for the door handle, my hand already closing around the cold metal, when a voice behind me said, very clearly and calmly, "You're early," and the certainty of it made me freeze in place. It was just after 6 in the morning, that dull, colorless hour where the day hasn't fully decided to exist yet, and the hallway outside my apartment was quiet in the way only early mornings are, thick with stillness and the faint smell of cleaning chemicals from the night crew. I stood there for a moment, my fingers still wrapped around the handle, waiting for the rest of the sentence that never came, listening for footsteps or a door opening, but nothing followed, and the silence pressed in softly around me. I turned around slowly, already expecting to see someone standing there, maybe a neighbor heading to work early, maybe someone I hadn't noticed at first, but the hallway was empty from one end to the other, lights humming overhead, doors closed, no movement at all. I told myself it must have been someone passing in the stairwell, their voice carrying strangely through the concrete, because sound does odd things in old buildings, especially at that hour, and that explanation felt reasonable enough to hold on to. Still, the words stuck with me. "You're early" wasn't something you say casually to a stranger in a hallway, and it wasn't said with surprise or confusion, just a quiet certainty, like an observation that had already been expected. I shook it off and stepped outside, letting the door close behind me with a soft click that echoed longer than usual, and the street greeted me with a thin gray light and the distant sound of traffic waking up. I went inside and locked the door, telling myself I was letting my imagination run ahead of me, that once you notice something strange, your mind looks for it everywhere. That night, I dreamed I was standing in the hallway again, but the lights were dimmer, flickering slightly, and the doors along the walls were open just enough to reveal darkness inside, and somewhere behind me, the same voice said, "You're early," with a tone that suggested I wasn't supposed to be there yet. I woke before I could turn around. After that, the phrase began to follow me. Not spoken, not aloud, but present in moments where time felt uncertain, when I arrived somewhere before anyone else, when a room felt unprepared for my presence, when the air seemed to pause as I entered. One morning, I left even earlier than usual, just to test it, stepping into the hallway while it was still dark outside, and I waited there, standing still, listening carefully. Nothing happened. But as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd missed something, that the timing had been wrong in a way I couldn't measure. Weeks passed, and life continued, but the memory of that voice never softened, never blurred, staying as clear as the moment I first heard it, and sometimes, late at night, I find myself wondering what I was early for. Lately, when I unlock my door, I pause before stepping inside, listening to the quiet apartment beyond, and I imagine someone standing just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to speak again. And every time I arrive somewhere too early now, I feel a faint, uncomfortable certainty that one day, the voice will come back, and this time, it won't sound surprised at all. I first noticed it on a quiet evening, just after the rain had stopped, when the road still smelled damp and the sky was slowly losing its color, that stretched out moment before night fully settles in and everything feels unfinished. I was standing at the corner, waiting for the pedestrian signal to change, watching cars pass with their headlights already on even though it wasn't completely dark yet, and that's when I saw her on the opposite side of the road. She stood alone near the curb, a few feet back, not pacing or checking her phone like most people do, just standing still with her arms relaxed at her sides, looking straight ahead at the crosswalk. There was nothing unusual about her at first. She looked like anyone else heading home, dark coat, hair pulled back loosely, shoes damp from the rain, and if I hadn't already been tired and distracted, I probably wouldn't have paid her any attention at all. The signal changed with its familiar clicking sound, and the white walking figure appeared. She stepped forward. As soon as she placed her foot onto the road, something felt wrong in a way I couldn't immediately describe, a quiet tension that made me stop just short of stepping out myself. The painted white lines of the crosswalk shifted. At first, I thought it was just the water on the road reflecting strangely, the lines bending slightly as her shadow crossed them, but as she took another step, the markings on the asphalt seemed to stretch toward her feet. They didn't slide smoothly. They dragged. The white paint distorted just enough to notice, thinning in places, thickening in others, as if the road were soft beneath her, like the lines were being gently pulled forward by her movement. I stayed where I was, my foot hovering awkwardly at the edge of the curb, watching her walk while the crosswalk subtly rearranged itself around her path. Each step she took caused the nearest line to lean toward her, not snapping back immediately, but lagging behind for a moment before settling into place again. No one else reacted. Cars remained stopped, engines idling quietly, and a man beside me stepped out onto the road without hesitation, walking a few paces behind her. His feet landing on the lines as if nothing were wrong. But when he stepped on them, they didn't move. Only hers did. She didn't look down. She didn't hesitate or change her pace, just crossed steadily, eyes forward, posture calm, like this was how roads always behaved for her. By the time she reached the middle of the street, the crosswalk no longer looked straight. The lines curved slightly inward, narrowing around her path, guiding her across in a way that felt intentional, almost careful. My mouth felt dry as I finally forced myself to move, stepping onto the road behind the others, half expecting the paint beneath my feet to shift too. It didn't. The lines were solid, fixed, cold under my shoes, exactly as they should be, and that contrast made my chest tighten. I glanced up at her again. She was almost across now, the lines behind her slowly straightening themselves out, relaxing back into their original positions as if nothing had disturbed them. When she stepped onto the opposite curb, the road looked normal again. Perfectly ordinary. She didn't look back. The signal changed, cars started moving, and the moment dissolved into noise and motion, but I stood there longer than I should have, staring at the crosswalk like it might explain itself if I waited. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I replayed the way the paint had moved, the slight delay, the way it seemed to follow her specifically, and every explanation I came up with fell apart as soon as I examined it closely. Paint doesn't stretch. Roads don't react. And yet I had watched it happen. A few days later, I found myself taking the same route again at around the same time, without fully admitting to myself that I was hoping to see her. The street looked the same. The crosswalk lines were straight and faded in the same places, cracked where they'd always been, and I felt a strange disappointment mixed with relief as I waited for the signal. When it changed, several people crossed, their footsteps dull against the asphalt, and nothing moved beneath them. I crossed too, watching the ground more than the traffic, but the road stayed still. I told myself that was the end of it. But after that, I started noticing crosswalks everywhere. The way the paint sometimes looked uneven, the way certain lines curved more than others, the way some crossings felt subtly narrower, like they'd been pulled inward over time. One evening, weeks later, I saw her again. It was a different intersection, farther from my apartment, one I didn't use often, and at first I wasn't sure it was her until she stepped forward from the curb with the same unhurried calm. This time, I was already watching the ground. The moment her foot touched the road, the nearest white line leaned toward her. There was no doubt now. The paint shifted slowly, almost reluctantly, following her steps like it recognized her, like it knew where she was going before she did. I felt my heart beating in my throat as I stayed back, pretending to adjust my bag, watching from the edge while the crosswalk reshaped itself just for her. A car honked somewhere behind me, impatient, and the sound made me flinch, but she didn't react. She crossed alone, guided by lines that bent gently inward, creating a path that only existed while she walked it. When she reached the other side, the lines relaxed again, settling back into something close to normal, though I could have sworn they didn't return exactly to where they'd been before. She paused at the curb this time. Just for a moment. She turned her head slightly, not enough to fully look at me, but enough that I knew she was aware of being seen. Then she walked away. I didn't follow. I crossed much later, after the signal cycled twice, my steps cautious, my eyes fixed on the paint beneath me, but the road remained unresponsive, indifferent to my presence. Since then, crossing streets has felt different. I notice how the lines seem to lean in certain places, how some crosswalks look subtly worn in patterns that don't match foot traffic, and I find myself wondering how many times she's crossed there. Sometimes, when I'm standing at a corner alone at dusk, watching the signal count down, I imagine the lines beneath my feet shifting slightly in anticipation, waiting to see if it's her again. And every time I step off the curb, there's a quiet moment of unease, when I'm not sure whether the road will stay still, or decide to follow someone else instead. I noticed it first because my hand reached out automatically and touched nothing but cold air, and that small, unexpected absence made me pause in the hallway longer than I normally would have. It was early evening, just after 7, the kind of hour where the building feels half awake, with distant televisions murmuring behind closed doors and the faint smell of someone's dinner drifting through the vents, and I was coming home the same way I always did. I had walked through that door less than 24 hours earlier. I remembered it clearly because the hinge had squeaked when I pushed it open, and I'd made a mental note to complain to the building manager, the sound sharp enough to cut through my tired thoughts as I carried my bag inside. Now, standing in the same hallway, under the same buzzing fluorescent light, the door was gone. Not closed. Not replaced. Gone. In its place was an unbroken stretch of painted wall, slightly scuffed near the floor, like people had brushed past it for years without ever stopping, and I felt my breath slow as my mind tried to catch up with what my eyes were telling it. I took a step back, then another, checking the apartment numbers on the doors nearby, making sure I hadn't somehow turned down the wrong hallway, even though the pattern of stains on the carpet and the crack running along the ceiling were unmistakably familiar. My apartment number was still there, fixed to the wall at eye level. But the door beneath it didn't exist. I stood there longer than felt reasonable, waiting for my confusion to resolve itself, waiting for the door to appear once I focused properly, but the wall remained solid and indifferent, offering no outline, no seam, nothing to suggest it had ever opened. A faint chill crept into my chest as I pressed my palm against the wall where the handle should have been, feeling only cool paint and drywall, smooth and uninterrupted, and the normality of that texture somehow made it worse. I told myself there had to be an explanation. Renovations happen. Walls get moved. Doors get relocated. Even as the thoughts formed, they felt thin and fragile, unable to support the weight of how certain I was that I'd unlocked that door the night before, stepped through it, and closed it behind me. I checked my phone, half expecting a message from the building management, some notice I'd missed, but there was nothing, just the usual notifications and the time ticking forward as if nothing unusual had happened. I walked down the hallway to the stairwell and back again, retracing my steps, counting doors, touching familiar scratches and dents along the way, but when I returned to the spot, the wall was still there, perfectly ordinary. A neighbor passed by, nodding politely as she walked toward the elevator, and I almost stopped her, almost asked if she could see what I was seeing, but the words stuck in my throat, suddenly embarrassed by how irrational it would sound. I stood aside and watched her walk past the place where my door should have been without hesitation, her shoulder passing inches from the wall as if it had always been that way. That was when the unease deepened. It wasn't just that the door was gone. It was that no one else seemed to notice it missing. I sat on the stairs for a while, listening to the building breathe around me, pipes knocking softly. Distant footsteps echoing above, and tried to reconstruct yesterday in my mind, clinging to details like anchors. I remembered setting my bag down just inside the door. I remembered the smell of dust when I turned on the light. I remembered locking the door before going to bed. Those memories felt intact, solid, but now they had nowhere to attach themselves. Eventually, with no better option, I went to the building manager's office on the ground floor, rehearsing what I would say, smoothing it into something that sounded reasonable, even as my hands felt slightly numb. He listened politely, his expression calm in the way people get when they assume there's been a simple misunderstanding, and followed me back upstairs without asking many questions. When we reached the hallway, he stopped beside me and looked at the wall. "This unit doesn't have a door," he said after a moment, his tone casual, certain. "It never has." The words settled heavily between us. I pointed to the apartment number, to the place where the handle should have been, my voice unsteady as I insisted that I lived there, that I'd used the door yesterday, that something wasn't right. He nodded slowly, the way you do when someone is upset but clearly mistaken, and told me there was no record of an apartment there, that the numbering had always skipped that space. I didn't argue after that. There was no room to. I thanked him and watched him walk away, his footsteps fading down the hallway, leaving me alone with the wall and the quiet hum of the lights. That night, I stayed with a friend, telling them a vague story about a lock issue, because I couldn't find a way to explain the truth without sounding unhinged, and even then, sleep came in fragments. I dreamed of standing in that hallway, my hand reaching for a door that appeared only when I wasn't looking directly at it, always just out of sight. The next morning, I returned. I stood in the same place, under the same light, staring at the same wall, hoping, irrationally, that something would have changed overnight. Nothing had. But as I turned to leave, I noticed something new. A faint scuff near the floor, shaped like the arc of a door swinging inward. It was subtle, easy to miss, and when I crouched down to look closer, it seemed less defined, like it didn't want to be examined for too long. I visit that building sometimes now, passing through the hallway under the pretense of visiting someone else, and I always pause at that stretch of wall, feeling a quiet pull there, like a place I used to belong to. Occasionally, when the building is especially quiet, I think I can hear the faint squeak of a hinge, somewhere just behind the paint, opening into a space that no longer exists. And each time, I find myself standing still, unsure whether I'm waiting for the door to come back, or for something on the other side to finally notice that I'm gone. I started noticing it after the third night in a row of sleeping badly, when the building seemed louder than usual but nothing specific ever happened, and the feeling followed me out of my apartment and into the hallway like something unfinished. It was close to 10 in the evening the first time I really paid attention to it, that dull hour when most lights are on but no one is moving much, and I stepped into the corridor with my key still warm in my hand, already feeling watched without knowing why. The hallway was lined with apartment doors on both sides, most of them dark, some with thin lines of light under the frames, and a few that had been empty for months. Their mail slots taped shut and their doorbells dusty from disuse. As I walked past those empty units, the sensation sharpened. It wasn't fear exactly, not at first, just a pressure between my shoulders, like someone standing too close behind me, close enough that I should be able to hear breathing if I slowed down enough. I stopped halfway down the corridor. The feeling didn't fade. If anything, it became more focused, directional, like attention narrowing in from several points at once, and I became suddenly aware of how many doors I was standing between. I laughed quietly under my breath, embarrassed by my own reaction, and told myself it was just fatigue, just the mind reacting to silence and repetition, but my eyes kept drifting to the peepholes set into each door. They looked darker than they should have. I continued walking, my footsteps soft against the worn carpet, and with each step, the feeling shifted slightly, as if it were keeping pace with me, adjusting, recalculating. When I reached the stairwell door, I turned around slowly, scanning the hallway. Nothing had changed. The doors were still closed. The lights still hummed. The emptiness remained complete and undisturbed. And yet, my skin prickled like I'd just interrupted something. Over the next few days, the sensation returned often enough that it stopped feeling random. Every time I passed the vacant apartments, especially the ones at the far end of the building where no one ever went, I felt that same quiet awareness settle over me, heavier the longer I stayed near them. During the day, it was easier to ignore. Sunlight softened the edges of the corridor, and sounds from outside filtered in through windows at the ends, giving everything a sense of movement and safety. But at night, the hallway felt longer. The shadows pooled more deeply around the doorframes, and the emptiness inside those units felt active. Like it was doing something I couldn't see. One evening, I slowed deliberately as I passed the most recently vacated apartment, the one across from the laundry room. I stood there, pretending to check my phone, giving myself an excuse to linger, and the moment I stopped moving, the sensation intensified. It felt like standing in the center of a room full of people who had gone silent at once. I raised my eyes to the door. The peephole stared back at me, dull and glassy, and I had the sudden, uncomfortable thought that it wasn't meant for me to look into, but for something inside to look out. I stepped away quickly, my heart beating harder than the situation seemed to warrant, and didn't slow down again until I was safely inside my apartment with the door locked behind me. That night, I dreamed of hallways. Endless ones, stretching far beyond the shape of the building I lived in, lined with doors that were all slightly open, just enough to suggest space beyond them, and from every gap, I felt eyes watching as I walked past, patient and unblinking. I woke before I could reach the end. After that, the feeling followed me more closely. Sometimes I sensed it even when I was still inside my apartment, sitting quietly, especially when the building settled and the pipes knocked softly in the walls, and I found myself listening for sounds that never came. Once, late at night, I heard a faint click in the hallway, like a door latch being tested gently, and I froze on my couch, holding my breath until the silence returned. The next morning, I checked. All the empty apartments were still sealed, their tape undisturbed, their door handles cool and unmoving, but the unease lingered like a smell you can't quite place. I started changing my routine without realizing it. I avoided the far end of the hallway. I took the elevator instead of the stairs so I wouldn't have to pass as many doors. I hurried when I couldn't avoid them, my eyes fixed ahead, my awareness narrowed to the sound of my own footsteps. One night, coming home later than usual, I felt it more strongly than ever. The building was unusually quiet, no televisions, no voices, just the steady hum of electricity, and as I walked down the corridor, the pressure of attention seemed to bloom all at once. It felt as though every empty apartment was occupied, not by people, but by something aware of my presence in a way that felt practiced. I stopped again, unable to help myself. The sensation focused sharply on the doors to my left. Not one. Several. As if whatever was watching wasn't confined to a single space, but spread thinly across many. I stood there, my breathing shallow, and waited for something to happen, for a sound, a movement, any confirmation that I wasn't imagining it. Nothing came. But as I finally turned the corner toward my apartment, I had the unmistakable sense that whatever had been watching me had leaned back, satisfied, like it had seen enough for now. Since then, I've stopped trying to explain it. I don't linger in the hallway anymore. I don't look at the doors. But sometimes, when I unlock my apartment late at night and step inside, I feel that same awareness settle briefly behind me, as if the empty apartments are still watching, even from a distance. And every so often, when the building is especially quiet, I find myself wondering whether those apartments are truly empty at all, or if they're simply waiting for someone to notice them for too long. It happened on a night when I was already walking slower than usual, the kind of evening where the air feels too still and every sound carries farther than it should, and the streetlights glow softly through a thin mist that hasn't quite become fog. I had taken a longer route home after work. I hurried when I couldn't avoid them, my eyes fixed ahead, my awareness narrowed to the sound of my own footsteps. One night, coming home later than usual, I felt it more strongly than ever. The building was unusually quiet, no televisions, no voices, just the steady hum of electricity, and as I walked down the corridor, the pressure of attention seemed to bloom all at once. It felt as though every empty apartment was occupied, not by people, but by something aware of my presence in a way that felt practiced. I stopped again, unable to help myself. The sensation focused sharply on the doors to my left. Not one. Several. As if whatever was watching wasn't confined to a single space, but spread thinly across many. I stood there, my breathing shallow, and waited for something to happen, for a sound, a movement, any confirmation that I wasn't imagining it. Nothing came. But as I finally turned the corner toward my apartment, I had the unmistakable sense that whatever had been watching me had leaned back, satisfied, like it had seen enough for now. Since then, I've stopped trying to explain it. I don't linger in the hallway anymore. I don't look at the doors. But sometimes, when I unlock my apartment late at night and step inside, I feel that same awareness settle briefly behind me, as if the empty apartments are still watching, even from a distance. And every so often, when the building is especially quiet, I find myself wondering whether those apartments are truly empty at all, or if they're simply waiting for someone to notice them for too long. It happened on a night when I was already walking slower than usual, the kind of evening where the air feels too still and every sound carries farther than it should, and the streetlights glow softly through a thin mist that hasn't quite become fog. I had taken a longer route home after work. Not for any particular reason, just to clear my head, and I found myself on a narrow street I didn't use often, lined with older buildings whose windows reflected more darkness than light. The pavement was dry, but the smell of rain still lingered, and my footsteps sounded careful, almost cautious, even though I wasn't consciously afraid of anything yet. I noticed her standing near the corner before I realized she was waiting for me. She was positioned under a streetlight that buzzed faintly, just bright enough to outline her shape without revealing much detail, and at first I assumed she was checking directions or waiting for someone to catch up. As I got closer, I saw she wasn't looking at her phone. She wasn't looking around at all. She was watching me approach with a quiet focus that made my pace slow without permission. I passed people occasionally on my walks, but something about her stillness felt deliberate, like she had already chosen that exact spot and time to stand there. When I reached the corner, she shifted her weight slightly and raised her arm. She pointed straight ahead, down the street I was already walking toward. "You can go that way," she said softly. Her voice was calm, almost helpful, the kind of tone people use when giving directions they've given many times before, and that normality made me nod automatically. I turned my head to follow where she was pointing. The street bent. It didn't curve naturally the way roads do over distance. It didn't slope or angle or disappear behind buildings. It bent away from her finger in a slow, unmistakable motion, like something flexible being gently pushed aside. The far end of the street shifted first, pulling left while the near end stayed fixed, creating a subtle kink in the middle that shouldn't have been possible. I stood there, my mouth dry, watching the buildings along the road tilt just enough to follow the bend. Their straight lines warping into something uneasy but precise. The streetlight reflections slid along the asphalt as if the surface were slightly wet, even though it wasn't. She kept her arm raised the entire time. Her finger didn't move. It was as if the street was responding to her, not the other way around. I looked at her face then, searching for some reaction, some acknowledgement of what was happening, but her expression remained neutral, almost patient, like this delay was expected. My heart was beating harder than the moment seemed to require, and I became suddenly aware of how quiet everything had become. No cars. No distant voices. Even the hum of the streetlight felt muted, pushed to the background. "I think I'll go another way," I said, though my voice came out quieter than I intended. She lowered her arms slowly. The street remained bent. She looked at me then, really looked at me, and for the first time her expression changed, just slightly, into something that felt like mild disappointment. "That way takes longer," she said. I didn't respond. I stepped back, my shoes scraping lightly against the pavement, and the sound felt too loud in the silence. The street did not straighten. It stayed warped, waiting. I turned and walked the way I had come, resisting the urge to look back, even as the sensation of being guided lingered uncomfortably between my shoulders. At the next intersection, I paused and glanced over my shoulder despite myself. She was still there. Still standing beneath the streetlight. But her arm was raised again, pointing in the same direction, even though I was no longer anywhere near the street she indicated. And the street was still bent. I took a different route home that night, one I knew well, sticking to wider roads and brighter areas, but the sense of misalignment followed me, like something had been nudged out of place and never fully returned. Later, from my apartment window, I looked down at the streets below, watching the lines of the road stretch out under the lights, all of them straight, all of them behaving as they should. Still, I couldn't shake the image of that bend, too sharp and too intentional to be a trick of perspective. Over the next few weeks, I avoided that area entirely. But sometimes, when I'm walking at night and someone points ahead to give directions, I hesitate before looking. And occasionally, when the street is quiet enough and the light is just right, I swear I can see the road ahead of me leaning slightly to one side, as if it's remembering where it was once told to go. The first thing I noticed was how quiet it suddenly felt, not silent exactly, just reduced, like someone had turned a dial somewhere and lowered the volume of the city by a small but deliberate amount. It was late evening, a little after 9, and I was walking along a busy road I used almost every day, the kind with constant traffic that never fully stops, where the sound of engines and tires usually forms a steady backdrop you stop noticing after a while. The sky was already dark, low clouds reflecting the orange glow of streetlights, and the air was cool enough to make my breath visible when I exhaled slowly, which was what I was doing, trying to unwind after a long day. Cars were still passing, headlights streaming by, buses groaning as they pulled away from stops, and yet something about the noise felt thinner, like it wasn't filling the space the way it should have. I slowed my pace without realizing it. The sound of traffic seemed to soften further as I did, not fading away, but pulling back, becoming more distant and careful, and I remember thinking it felt similar to when you lower your voice because someone nearby might be asleep. I stopped at a crosswalk and stood there, waiting for the signal to change, and the moment I stopped moving, the noise dipped again. Not all at once. Just enough to notice. The engine sounded muted, horns less sharp, even the hiss of tires against wet pavement felt dampened, and I became suddenly aware of how clearly I could hear my own breathing. I glanced around, expecting to see someone nearby, maybe a police car or roadwork, something that might explain the shift, but the street looked the same as it always did, cars flowing steadily in both directions. No one else seemed to react. People walked past me with headphones in, crossing when the light changed, talking quietly to companions, completely unaware that the city around them had just leaned in slightly. As I stepped off the curb and began crossing, the traffic noise rose again, but only partially, like it was allowing movement but still holding itself back. The sensation made my shoulders tense. I reached the other side and slowed again, pretending to check my phone, and once more, the sound dipped, engines dropping to a low murmur, like the street was waiting. Waiting for what, I couldn't tell. I told myself it was my imagination, that maybe my ears were adjusting, or that the wind had shifted in some subtle way, but the pattern stayed consistent enough to make my thoughts uneasy. When I walked, the noise returned. When I stopped, it lowered. Not completely. Just enough. I tested it again farther down the road, stopping abruptly near a bus stop, and the moment I did, the sound of traffic softened around me, creating a strange pocket of reduced noise that felt centered on where I stood. I felt exposed in a way I couldn't explain. Like I had drawn attention by doing nothing at all. A bus pulled in nearby, its brakes sighing loudly, and for a moment the illusion broke, the noise surging back to normal levels, and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. But when the bus pulled away and I remained still, the quiet returned, settling gently, expectantly. I started walking again, this time faster, uncomfortable with the idea of stopping, and the city resumed its usual volume, filling the space with familiar chaos. Still, the feeling stayed with me, like a hand resting lightly on my back. As I continued home, I noticed smaller sounds more clearly than usual. The click of a pedestrian signal. The rustle of leaves along the curb. A distant siren that seemed farther away than it should have been. It was as if the traffic had stepped aside to make room for something else to be heard. Halfway down the block, I slowed again, unable to help myself. The noise dipped. I felt a quiet certainty then, an unsettling awareness that whatever was listening didn't need silence, just cooperation. I didn't know what it was listening for. My footsteps. My breathing. My thoughts. I stood there, heart beating steadily, and waited, unsure what I expected to happen, but deeply aware that something was happening already. After a few seconds, I started walking again, and the traffic sound swelled obediently, masking the space I'd occupied. When I reached my apartment later that night, the memory followed me inside. From my window, I looked out at the road below, watching the steady flow of cars, listening to the constant wash of sound that had always felt so reliable. Everything sounded normal. Too normal. I stood there for a long time, listening, wondering if the noise would lower again if I stopped moving entirely, if I stood still enough, long enough, for whatever had been listening to decide it had heard enough. Since then, I've noticed it in other places too. On busy streets where the noise seems to pull back slightly when I pause. At intersections where the sound softens just long enough to make me aware of it. I don't stop walking anymore unless I have to. And sometimes, late at night, when the city should be loudest, I catch myself standing still in my apartment, listening to the traffic below, trying to tell whether it's fading naturally. Or whether it's quieting itself. Just in case. It happened on a night when I wasn't thinking about anything unusual at all, which is why the moment stayed with me so stubbornly afterward, refusing to soften or fade the way small mistakes usually do. I was walking home just after 10, the air cool and dry, the streetlights already on and casting long, clean shadows across the sidewalk, and I remember feeling oddly calm, my thoughts unfocused, my steps automatic and familiar. The street was quiet but not empty, a few cars passing now and then, distant voices drifting from somewhere I couldn't see, and the rhythm of my footsteps felt steady enough that I didn't need to think about where I was going. I noticed my shadow because it stretched unusually far ahead of me, elongated by a streetlight position just right, its shape crisp against the pale concrete, moving in sync with me like it always had. I took a few steps and watched it slide forward. Then I slowed slightly to check my phone. I didn't stop. I only slowed. But my shadow did. It paused. Not completely frozen, not sharply cut off, just hesitating for a brief moment, as if it hadn't received the same instruction to move forward that my body had, and that fraction of a second made my chest tighten. I told myself it was nothing. The angle of the light. An uneven patch of pavement. My eyes adjusting. I lifted my head and kept walking, forcing myself not to look down again too quickly, because I didn't want to confirm something I wasn't ready to understand. A few steps later, I glanced down anyway. The shadow was moving again, stretched and obedient. Keeping pace with me like it always had, and I felt a small rush of relief that faded almost immediately into doubt. I hadn't imagined the pause. I was sure of that. It hadn't been dramatic. No sharp break. Just a subtle delay, like something momentarily distracted. I walked on, my awareness narrowed now, every sense turned slightly inward, and I began watching the ground ahead of me more closely than the street itself. At the next streetlight, my shadow shifted position, reforming at a different angle, and I watched carefully as I passed beneath it, half expecting it to hesitate again. It didn't. It moved smoothly, stretching and shrinking as it should, and I let myself breathe a little easier, though my shoulders stayed tense. I told myself that if it happened again, I would stop completely. I would test it. I walked another block before slowing my pace intentionally, just enough to notice the change in my steps, just enough to see how the shadow reacted. This time, it slowed with me. No pause. No delay. I almost laughed at myself for being so on edge, for letting a trick of light unsettle me like that, and I picked up my pace, trying to shake the feeling loose. But the sense of being slightly out of sync stayed with me, subtle but persistent, like wearing shoes that don't quite fit. I reached a quieter stretch of the street, where the lights were farther apart and the shadows longer and softer, and the city noise faded into a low, distant hum that made everything feel suspended. I stopped walking. Completely. My feet planted. My body still. My shadow stopped too, pooling at my feet, shapeless and dark, and for a moment, everything felt normal enough that I wondered why my heart was beating so hard. I waited. Nothing happened. I took a step forward. The shadow followed. I took another. Still normal. I stood there longer than necessary, letting the silence settle around me. Listening to my own breathing, and eventually convinced myself that whatever I'd seen earlier had been a momentary illusion, a coincidence amplified by fatigue. I turned toward home and continued on, eager now to be indoors, surrounded by walls and light that behaved predictably. Halfway down the block, I noticed something else. My shadow felt closer. Not shorter or longer. Closer. As if it had edged nearer to my feet than it should have been given the angle of the light, and that awareness made me adjust my stride without thinking, lengthening it slightly. The shadow didn't stretch to match. It stayed close. I slowed again, this time deliberately, and watched as my foot moved forward. The shadow followed. Then, just as my foot settled, the shadow lagged. Only a fraction. Only enough to notice. It felt like standing next to someone who hesitates before mirroring your movements, just enough to make you aware of their attention. I stopped. My body stilled. The shadow caught up. I didn't look away this time. I stood there under the streetlight, staring at the dark shape at my feet, my thoughts unsteady, my breath shallow, waiting to see if it would do anything on its own. It didn't move. But the longer I watched it, the more uncomfortable I became, not because it looked wrong, but because it looked too settled, like it was content to wait there with me. I broke eye contact first. I turned and walked quickly the rest of the way home, not looking down again, not checking the ground even when my instincts urged me to, and the familiar shapes of my building came into view sooner than I expected. Inside, under the steady ceiling lights, there were no shadows to speak of, just soft, diffuse darkness beneath furniture, and I felt an immediate, physical relief as I closed the door behind me. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment again and again, the pause, the delay, the subtle resistance. And every explanation I came up with felt insufficient. Light doesn't hesitate. Shadows don't decide. They follow. In the days since, I've noticed myself walking differently at night, keeping my pace steady, avoiding sudden stops, avoiding bright lights that cast sharp outlines on the ground. Sometimes, though, when I'm standing still under a streetlight, I feel an urge to move just to check, just to make sure everything is still aligned. I don't always give in to it. Because lately, I've started to wonder whether the shadow pauses because it's confused. Or because, for a brief moment, it's deciding whether it needs to follow me at all. I didn't notice her right away, which is what bothers me most now, because it means she had already been part of the street before my attention ever landed on her. It was late, close to 11, and the night had settled into that quiet, suspended state where sounds feel far away and deliberate, like they're choosing when to exist. The air was cool, not cold, and the pavement still held the day's warmth, releasing it slowly as I walked. I was heading home along a narrow residential road, the kind lined with parked cars and evenly spaced streetlights, familiar enough that I didn't need to think about where I was going. She was walking ahead of me, maybe 20 feet away. I noticed her because our pace matched too well. No matter how I adjusted my stride, the distance between us stayed the same, and that quiet synchronization pulled my attention forward without any conscious decision on my part. She wore a dark coat that reached just past her knees, and her hair fell straight down her back, moving slightly with each step. Nothing about her seemed unusual. That was the problem. She belonged to the night in a way that felt complete, like she had always been there and always would be, and I realized I couldn't remember when she'd entered my field of view. One moment the street had been empty ahead of me, and the next, she was simply there, walking. I told myself I'd just been distracted. I focused on the sound of my footsteps, on the soft click of her shoes against the pavement ahead, keeping time with mine, and the repetition created a rhythm that made the street feel narrower than it was. We approached a stretch where two streetlights stood farther apart than usual, leaving a longer pocket of shadow between them. The darkness there felt thicker, not deeper exactly, just heavier, like it absorbed sound instead of letting it pass through. She walked into that darker section without slowing. I followed, my eyes adjusting, the edges of the street blurring slightly until the next pool of light came into view ahead of her. I remember thinking, briefly and without urgency, that if she turned into one of the side streets or driveways, I'd stop paying attention. She didn't turn. She kept walking straight. As she reached the edge of the shadow, just before the light touched her shoulders, she took a step forward. Then she took another. Between those two steps, she disappeared. There was no blur. No fade. No sudden movement. Her body was simply no longer there. One step she existed, her foot lifting, her coat shifting slightly with the motion. The next step landed, and the space ahead of me was empty. I stopped walking so abruptly my foot skidded slightly on the pavement, the sound too loud in the quiet, and I stood there staring at the place where she should have been, my heart slowing instead of racing, as if my body hadn't decided yet how to react. The street was empty. Completely. No doorways nearby she could have entered. No cars pulling out. No sound of footsteps fading. Just an uninterrupted stretch of road illuminated by the streetlight she should have reached. I waited. I don't know what I was waiting for, exactly, but I stood there longer than felt reasonable. Scanning the edges of the light, the shadows between parked cars, the dark gaps between houses, expecting some sign that she'd moved quickly or quietly. Nothing appeared. The air felt unchanged. The night continued as if nothing had happened. I walked forward slowly, my steps cautious now, approaching the spot where she'd vanished, half expecting to feel something different there, a shift in temperature or pressure, some marker I could point to later and say, this is where it happened. There was nothing. The pavement looked normal. The light behaved the way light always does. I stood exactly where she had been and looked around, turning in a slow circle, and the street revealed nothing new from any angle. I told myself she must have turned so quickly I hadn't registered it, even though there was nowhere she could have gone without making a sound. I told myself my eyes had adjusted poorly, that the contrast between shadow and light had played a trick on me. The explanations stacked up quickly and collapsed just as fast. I walked the rest of the way home with my attention fixed ahead of me, scanning constantly, my senses tuned too high, the silence pressing close to my ears. Every dark gap between cars felt expectant. Every doorway looked like it might release someone at any moment. When I reached my building, I paused outside longer than usual, listening, letting the familiar sound settle me, and eventually convinced myself that what I'd seen had been a momentary lapse, a brief misalignment between attention and reality. But the image stayed. Not of her disappearing. Of the space she left behind. Over the next few days, I found myself watching people's movements more closely than before, especially at night. I paid attention to steps, to the way bodies pass through light and shadow, to the moments where visibility falters. Everyone else moved continuously. Predictably. Until one evening, a week later, I was walking down a different street at roughly the same time, and I noticed a woman ahead of me whose pace matched mine too well. The distance stayed constant. Her coat fell to her knees. Her hair moved slightly with each step. I slowed. She slowed. I stopped. She took one more step and stopped too, standing just at the edge of a darker stretch of road. I didn't move. Neither did she. The silence grew heavier, layered with the distant hum of the city, and I felt a familiar, creeping certainty settle into my chest. She took a step forward. I held my breath. She took another. And this time, she didn't disappear. She continued walking, her shape steady and solid as she moved into the light, and the tension drained from my shoulders so suddenly it made me dizzy. She turned the corner a moment later and was gone normally, the way people are supposed to leave your sight. I stood there for a long time after that, unsure whether I felt relieved or disappointed. Now, when I walk at night and see someone ahead of me, I find myself counting their steps without meaning to, watching carefully as they move through shadow, bracing myself for the moment when motion might break into absence again. And sometimes, when a person slips briefly behind a parked car or into a darker stretch of road, and reappears where they should, I feel a quiet, uneasy gratitude. Because I still think about that space between two steps. About how thin it felt. And how easily someone could slip through it without leaving anything behind at all. I didn't notice it all at once, which feels important now, because if the city had changed suddenly, I might have trusted my instincts and paid attention sooner, but it didn't change like that, it adjusted quietly, the way memory does when you're not looking directly at it. It started on an evening walk. Just after dusk, when the sky was still holding onto a faint blue and the streetlights were coming on one by one, and I took a route I hadn't used in months without consciously deciding to. My feet turned down the street before my thoughts did, and I remember thinking it felt familiar in a way that didn't quite belong to me. The buildings were older there, narrow and pressed close together, their windows dark or glowing softly behind thin curtains, and as I walked, I felt a subtle sense of recognition, like the street was expecting me, even though I couldn't remember the last time I'd been on it. A shop window reflected my movement as I passed, and for a brief moment, I had the odd impression that my reflection had already been there, waiting, before aligning itself with my steps, and that feeling stayed with me longer than it should have. Further down the street, a traffic light turned green just as I reached the intersection, without me breaking stride, and I felt a small, irrational flicker of gratitude toward it, like it had done me a favor rather than followed a timer. I shook the thought away and kept walking. By the time I reached my apartment that night, the sense of familiarity had dulled, filed away under fatigue and routine, and I didn't think about it again until a few days later, when it happened somewhere else. I was exiting a subway station I rarely used, one that sat deeper underground than most, its walls tiled in a pattern I didn't remember choosing to like, and as I climbed the stairs, I realized I knew exactly how many steps remained without counting them. That realization made me slow. I tested it, stopping halfway up, then continuing, and my expectation matched the reality perfectly, right down to the slightly uneven last step that rose higher than the rest. At the top, the street opened up around me, noisy and bright, and for a moment, I felt disoriented. Like I'd surfaced into the wrong place at the wrong time. Then a pedestrian signal changed, and people began crossing around me, and the city resumed its usual indifference. Still, something lingered. Over the next few weeks, small things kept happening. A door unlocked more easily than it should have. A crosswalk light changed the moment I reached the curb. A bus slowed just enough that I didn't have to run. None of it was impossible. None of it was dramatic. But taken together, it felt coordinated, like a series of accommodations made quietly, without acknowledgement. I told myself it was coincidence. Cities are systems. Patterns emerge. We notice what benefits us. That explanation held, until one evening when I found myself standing in front of a building I was certain I had never entered. It was tucked between two larger structures, its entrance recessed slightly, the glass door smudged with fingerprints and age, and yet I stood there with my hand hovering near the handle, knowing exactly how it would feel when I touched it. Cold. Heavier than it looked. The door opened inward, just as I expected, and the lobby beyond smelled faintly of dust and old paper, a scent that settled into me with a strange sense of recognition. I stood inside, heart beating steadily, not fast, not slow, just attentive, and tried to remember when I had last been there. Nothing came. No image. No memory. Just certainty. I stepped back outside and let the door close, the sound of it echoing a little longer than it should have, and walked away without turning back, my thoughts unsettled in a way I couldn't put into words. That night, I dreamed of streets. Not specific ones, but fragments of them, intersections without names, stairwells without buildings, alleys that curved gently out of sight, and in the dream, I moved through them easily, instinctively, never hesitating, never lost. I woke with the feeling that I had been somewhere I'd forgotten on purpose. After that, the city began to feel less neutral. Sometimes, when I paused on a sidewalk, the traffic noise seemed to soften slightly, like the space around me was adjusting its attention. Sometimes, when I hesitated at a corner, unsure which way to go, I felt a subtle pull in one direction, not physical, not forceful, just a suggestion that carried weight. I followed it more often than I'd like to admit. One afternoon, I passed a small park I had no memory of ever visiting, and yet I knew which bench creaked when you sat on it, which path dipped slightly in the middle, which tree cast the longest shadow near sunset. I stood there, watching people pass, children playing, dogs pulling at leashes, and I felt an uncomfortable sense of being recognized, not by anyone in particular, but by the space itself. As if the ground beneath my feet remembered my weight. I started to question my own memory. I dug through old photos on my phone, looking for evidence, for familiar corners or backgrounds that might explain this growing sense of déjà vu, but nothing matched, nothing confirmed what my body seemed so sure of. Friends didn't notice anything unusual. When I mentioned certain places, they shrugged, commented casually, moved on, and I learned quickly not to push, not to sound like I was grasping at something I couldn't explain. The realization settled slowly, reluctantly. The city knew me. Not in a sentimental way. Not fondly. It knew my pace, my pauses, the routes I favored when I didn't know why, the moments when I slowed or stopped or hesitated, and it responded accordingly, smoothing things out, adjusting timing, making space. What frightened me wasn't that it remembered me. It was that I didn't remember why. One evening, walking home under a low, clouded sky, I passed a narrow side street I was sure I had avoided before, though I couldn't say when or why, and as I reached the corner, I felt a quiet resistance settle into my steps. I stopped. The streetlight ahead flickered faintly, not failing, just wavering, and the street beyond it felt thin, like it didn't want to be used. I waited. Nothing happened. People passed behind me, traffic flowed, the city continued on its surface, but that small side street remained subtly withdrawn, like it was holding its breath. I turned away and continued home, my chest tight with an unease that didn't fade once I was inside. Now, I pay attention to the way the city behaves around me. To the moments when paths open easily. To the places that seem reluctant to let me pass. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm standing still on an empty street and the noise dims just a little too much, I wonder what the city remembers about me that I've lost. Because whatever it is, it still hasn't forgotten. And I'm not sure what will happen if one day, it decides to remind me.